This is Van Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air on our Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter channels with Lucinda Sage-Midgorden for the first time. Thank you and welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, we have a sponsor, Newsly.me, and if you use coupon code GHOST21, 2021, and that still works. You can get 1 month free premium subscription. What they do is they translate video podcast to audio podcast, so you can listen to them on your headphones or on your AirPods. So if you go and listen to, if you use coupon code GHOST2021, you get 1 month free premium subscription, and you can stop scrolling and start listening. So that's our sponsor. They will actually have this podcast on after the episode is published. So I just wanted to tell everybody about that. And now we've got your website out, and we've always like to tell people to, every time we talk to an artist or a content creator on this program, we encourage people to check out the website URL that we stream below. So we've got sagewoman.life there. So check that out.
Thank
so welcome
you very
to the
much.
podcast again.
Thank you.
So I always like to start with every artist or content person that I talk to, and you seem to be a really deep lover of theater and speech and writing and blogging and podcasting. When did you first discover that you wanted to get into like the theater or into written word as your art?
Well, I'm 69 years old, so this goes back a way long time, probably when I was maybe 7 or 8 or 9 years old. We would have family movie night, and my parents used those stories that we watched on television to talk about the emotions of the characters and why did they make the decisions that they made and which ones did we relate to or not relate to, and finally we would also talk about what the story meant. So it all kind of started there when I was a child. And as I was growing up, it was mostly just my dad and I. When I got to high school, we would watch movies together and talk about them. And so I was the kid in English class that everybody would roll their eyes because whenever we would read something, I would be talking about the characters and what, in the story and what they were thinking and feeling maybe. And all the other kids were like, what, how do you know all this stuff? Well, it's because of my mom and dad. And so after I graduated from high school, I took about a 4-year hiatus. I didn't want to go to college right away. But when I did, I became a religious studies major because I was really interested in all those spiritual stories and all those myths from the different religions and stuff. I didn't want to be a minister. I just wanted to study all that. So again, it was all about story. And then my second year, I was still studying religious studies, but I became involved in the theater program at the college where I was going. They had a club, and I would audition for the plays, and sometimes I would work backstage, and sometimes I'd be in the play. And that was a really great eye opener for me because I started to realize that the more I acted, the more roles I had. I realized that I had a lot in common with the characters that I was playing. Now, not all of them, because one of them was a pathological liar, and I don't lie very well. So that one was difficult. When I was getting my master's, I was playing that part. But there is always some part of me that was part same as the character. So I could identify with them and do a pretty good job of playing. I don't think I was like Meryl Streep or anything like that, but I really enjoyed it. And after I got my master's, my husband and I moved after we graduated from the Midwest to Portland, Oregon. And I got my master's at Portland State University and did a lot of theater there, worked in the costume shop and worked backstage and, and then I got involved in the Portland theater scene, and they had a company called the Musical Company that was sponsored by the city. And I did a lot of work for them. both backstage and on stage. But there were other theater companies that I did work with as well. So it was, excuse me for clearing my throat. It was really just, it was so wonderful, except that I would go to rehearsal right after my husband got home from work. We'd maybe eat dinner and have about half an hour, 45 minutes together. And then I'd be off to rehearsal and I'd get home about 11:30 or 12 o'clock at night, and he would be asleep. And then in the morning, he would kiss me goodbye at 7 o'clock in the morning and wake me up and kiss me goodbye. And so we didn't get to see each other very much. So eventually I had to make a choice. And so I stopped doing theater
Oh,
that
wow.
way because, and I mean, I remember the last night of the last show, I just wept because I loved it so much. But sometime later, we moved to Arizona, and then I got to start teaching it, which was
Oh,
the
wow.
best of both worlds
So then you could
because
do it during the day and it wouldn't conflict.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
and the when I was directing a play, the rehearsals would be like right after school,
Mhm.
and we'd finish about maybe 7 or 8 o'clock at night, 7 o'clock, something like that. Now, the only bad thing was I was getting my master's in education, teaching school, doing that full time, teaching school full time, and directing plays as well. So
We're still busy.
I was I didn't have any time to myself, and I'm an introvert, and I require that time to
Yeah.
myself. So for those 2 years, that was really, really difficult. But it was also really wonderful. I loved the teaching drama. I discovered how much fun that was. Unfortunately, somebody else wanted my job, and so they maneuvered me out of that job, and I had to go teach English in a different town. But I discovered that I love that too because an avid reader,
Mhm.
and it was I was teaching American lit, which was I didn't British lit is sort of my thing, at least it was then,
Yeah.
and so reading all of the you know famous American authors, mostly it was short stories, but some of the plays, though, like The Crucible was one of the plays that we read. I can't remember all of them. And those, I already knew a lot about those because I had
Mhm.
studied them. So that was fun. And then sometime as I was teaching English, I realized, you know, excuse me again, I know how to teach these students how to be good writers, and I had always kind of had this lingering wish I could be a writer feeling. I took playwriting and when I was getting my master's and loved that I was in control of the story.
Yeah.
But you know how that little thing in your head goes, "Oh no, you can't do that. You can't make any money doing that." You know how that goes,
Yeah.
I'm
Well, it's
sure.
like all musicians, we run into the same thing. It's like, why are you gonna write your own song? Right? Like,
Mhm.
because people, as soon as you become a musician, people start saying, well, you should just cover other people's songs because you're never going to be as good as Smokey. You're never going to be good as like James Brown. It's like, how could you even try? Right. So there's some
Right,
musicians, they just kind of psych themselves out of it because they're
right,
like, they look at their heroes and, well, I'm never going to be Hendrix. So I'm
right,
not even going to try. But I think what people forget is like, you can be the best you, right? You could
right,
bring something to the table that it didn't exist, and
right.
you're just trying to compare yourself to like the top people in any field, like you're not giving yourself a chance.
Exactly, exactly. Well, and I was when I started teaching at that school, I was like 50 or 51 or something. So I was already pretty far along on my getting rid of that little noise in my head. And so but and also that school was an hour away. School started at 7:20 and I had to be there at 7 o'clock. I had to leave at 6 o'clock in the
Oh, wow.
morning. I had to get up
Me
at
too.
4 o'clock in the morning. It was totally against my body clock to do that. But but that was a really great school district to work for, and the students were fantastic. It's just that this some little thing in my being said, you need to stop and be a writer. And which is, a long, long time of me thinking, oh, I can't be a writer. But so I did. I retired after teaching 10 years in public school. I retired and started teaching at the college. So that was part-time teaching at the college. I was teaching acting and introduction to theater. There were only a few classes that I was teaching there. And a class called dramatic structure, which I absolutely loved because it was analyzing stories, just like I'd done with my parents, So, so while I was teaching part-time at the college, I started working on a memoir, which it was really horrible. But it taught me that, as one of my friends used to say, your first draft is crap, so don't worry about it, just write it and then continue writing. Well, but I threw that out, the memoir out, and started working on a novel that I'd started, maybe 10 or 15 years before. And that's the novel that eventually became The Space Between Time, which is a novel of two women, one in the present who has this horrible crash and burn kind of time when her fiance breaks their engagement, her mother dies in a terrible car accident, and she loses her job all in the same week. Wow. And so when she's home taking care of her mom's house and kind of cleaning it out, she inherited the house and it was paid for, so she has a place to live now that she doesn't have a job. She finds these journals, and they are very old. And so she opens them up and starts reading and discovers that they are the journals of her 3 times great-grandmother. And the minute she starts reading them, her consciousness enters her grandmother, her 3 times great-grandmother's consciousness. So it's not a time travel necessarily in that her body goes to another time. It's just her consciousness that goes. And she discovers that when she comes back into her body, no time has passed in her present time.
It's like a spiritual kind of sci-fi thing?
Mm-hmm. Or magical realism, maybe.
Magical realism? Yeah.
Yeah.
But and yeah, so it seems like something like you could see on a Twilight Zone or
something like that.
Yeah.
So she and her 3 times great-grandmother lives in Vermont. And well, there's a whole bunch. She's having drama in her life too. But she takes the Oregon Trail. This is 1859, the year that Jenna enters her 3 times great-grandmother's consciousness. She takes the Oregon Trail to Oregon to become a teacher. And so as Morgan, the grandmother's learning things, Jenna's learning things from her too. And so eventually Morgan becomes aware that there's this consciousness inside of her, this extra consciousness inside of her head, and they start to have communication with each other. So and then the sequel, I started right after I finished the rough draft of that, which was in 2015, and I wanted Morgan to become involved in the suffrage movement, but there wasn't really very much going on in the women's movement in 2014. And so I was sort of stuck on Jenna's timeline. And then in 2017, when the whole thing with Bill Cosby and Roger Ailes and Harvey Weinstein.
So the Me Too movement gave you some inspiration.
Yes. And so now I have to blame myself because I do have most of Morgan's timeline, but I always struggle with the present timeline.
Present time. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have to decide if I'm going to include COVID, because then COVID came along. But I have to go back and keep working on that part and then figure out how to integrate the two. So
I guess I had a question like you're working on like plays and you're into the book right now. Have you ever like thought of converting that into like a screenplay, like the
You
first book?
know, that might be in my future at some point because I really did enjoy writing plays. But the thing about plays and movies, which I always try to tell people who say, oh, the movie's not like the book. Well, it's a completely different art form.
Mhm.
And you only have a very limited amount of time to tell a story in a
Yeah,
movie.
like a novel, you can let it go. You could go 700 pages on a
Mhm.
novel. You go 1,000. In a movie, you
Yeah.
have to like speed everything up. You know,
Or be
or,
very selective.
or just have little pictures of those timelines with short
Mhm.
little vignettes that kind of give you flashbacks to it. But you can't go through the whole thing that you could do in a novel.
Right.
You can know a novel, you could do the whole complete thought, where you might
Right.
have a glimpse of it in a movie.
Exactly. Or there are timelines or things that you have to cut out from the novel that people get really upset about because that was their favorite part,
Yeah, yeah.
stuff like
You
that.
never know when you have the fans, it's like, "Why did you drop that piece?" You know, because that's the
Right,
part I
yeah.
like the best. But it's like, yeah, but you're making the directors make choices, right? Because
Right.
you write your book and then a screenplay, it could be a totally different person does it, adapts the
Mhm.
screenplay, and then they
Right.
start saying, "Well, what's gonna work at the
Right.
box office?" So they start
Right.
pulling stuff out or they start
Mhm.
changing it to make it
Mhm.
work so
Mhm.
it would actually work as a movie. It's kind of like if you're when you're a poet and you start to become a songwriter, a poem doesn't work as a song usually unless you're like Dylan.
Yes.
But you have to
Right.
actually rewrite your poem to fit the rhythms and structure of a song.
Exactly. And see, I think that's the way it is with writing too. At least the way I think of it is I like now I'm not professing to be a really great writer. But I am sensitive to the rhythm of words and the way sentences are put together to get the right rhythm. So, as I was actually, I'm going to do a side thing here. I was going to do my own audiobook of that, and I
Oh,
discovered,
you were gonna read it? You were gonna
oh
read it?
yeah, oh yeah, and but I had a really hard time keeping because I have kind of a lot of characters. Keeping track of all the voices and that kind of
Oh,
thing
yeah, it's
was
hard.
really difficult. But the other thing was I would read the sentences out loud, and to me they felt really clunky because the rhythm wasn't quite right. Now, probably they're okay when you're reading them, just reading them silently,
Yeah, if you
but
speak things out, sometimes the written
mhm,
page versus the spoken page, and that's why the
mhm,
screenwriter changes it because they say, "Well,
mhm,
that doesn't work." So they try to, they
mhm.
adapt it. There's the reasons why they do it.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, I have studied Shakespeare. I'm not an expert on it, but the rhythm of his
Yeah, it's a poem.
lines,
It's a total poem. It's a poem structure, yeah.
right. I mean, even the lower class characters, that's all in prose, but still the rhythm of the prose.
Yeah, it's still somewhat
we-
in a poetic type of timing,
Right.
that's to get with those type of
Yeah.
classic pieces of literature, you start
Right.
to see, like, in music, like, we're always looking for, whether you're a folk musician or a hip hop musician or a rock musician, there's always that rhythm to your vocal. Your vocal
Right.
track has its own rhythm. Usually it tries to tie to something in the
Hmm.
beat, but sometimes it can actually be different and those are more complicated. But
Right.
yeah, you're always trying to make it fit. You make it
Right.
work.
Yeah. And sometimes you can tell when you don't like a song, it's like, why don't I like that song? Well, it's because something's not quite right with the rhythm or something.
Yeah, it
Or
might be
in this,
it might be like polyrhythmic. There's an idea like
yeah,
in music called polyrhythms, and
right.
either
Yeah.
you get it right or you don't.
Right. Yeah. Well, and it's the same way with books that are written beautifully and others that are sort of like mine that are, well, they're okay, but they're not like these beautiful works of art. So, to go back to your question though about did I ever think about writing a play? If I do, it won't be these this
This
these two
story,
books story.
or you would
Yeah.
actually do a different topic for a play because
Mhm.
you don't feel this would translate to like off Broadway
Mm-mm.
But maybe it
Mm-mm.
would translate to a movie, but maybe it wouldn't
Or,
translate to off Broadway or
or
Broadway type thing,
yeah, or like a series, sort of like
like a TV show.
Outlander.
Oh yeah,
Yeah. Although, oh my gosh, her books are so dense. I don't know if you've ever read any of them, but I've read 4 of them, and there's so much goes on in them. They can't keep all that stuff in the television
yeah. It's
shows.
hard to. It's like when you get these, it's like when you take Tolkien, like how much of that do you actually translate to the screen? Because like you
Exactly.
actually go read The Hobbit and you read those books
Mhm.
and you see what they did. They did as much
Mhm.
as they could, but it's still not the depth of what's in Tolkien's books.
Right.
You know,
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So, well, and there are different ways that movie makers try to get that depth, but it's not, it's all visual
yeah,
mostly.
you deal with the visuals because that's what you can try to interpret, and you can try
Right.
to put that like layers into that. But so it's really interesting um, that you've been in these different formats. But like, what's the hardest or most fun parts of either doing a play or writing a book?
Probably just starting. Uh, I'll give an example. The year, it was only actually a few months before the Harvey Weinstein story broke. I had decided I was going to direct at the college Measure for Measure, which is Shakespeare's version of Me Too kind of situation.
Hmm.
And I had seen it years ago when I was in undergraduate school, and I absolutely loved the play, but it's not done very often. It's not a
Yeah, I
play
haven't
that's
heard
done
that
very
much
often.
about it. I'm not that familiar with it. I guess it's not that common.
Yeah, I don't know why. Maybe it's being done more now since Me Too and
Yeah,
Time's
probably
Up
it
movement.
is.
But I had never directed a Shakespeare play before, and just the language alone is really difficult. And I wanted it to be something that was very vibrant, something where the actors are active and they're, interacting with each other and their body language fits what they're saying. But I didn't quite know how to do that. So fortunately, I was contacted by a theater professional who was kind of on hiatus between jobs. And his father happens to live in a town not too far from where I live. I live out in the country. And he said, I've done that play 7 times. I have a shortened version of it, and I'd be willing to help you.
Oh, wow.
So I said, oh, fantastic. So he did help, although he got a job. This theater company that knows him, they had an emergency and they needed him to come up to Alaska to fix their play, whatever it was. So he had to leave kind of in the middle of he was there at the beginning and he was there at the end. But his advice to the students, to me, was so helpful, and it made the play successful. And so that started a collaboration for several years. And now he's taking over all my classes. I've retired now from the college,
Oh, wow.
and he's taking over all my classes. So, but yeah, I learned so much from him about the different kinds of rhythms and how the students could interact with each other. And, but in that situation, I just had to begin. It was daunting. It's always daunting to
But that's
start a
interesting
book.
that you found a partnership or a collaborator, because I think a lot of
Mhm.
people think like, oh, when you're an author, that's like just a one person effort.
Mhm.
But a lot of times
Mhm.
they're editors or their friends that are kind of involved with the
Right.
writer, giving them like
Right.
assistance. And it's interesting
Yes.
that have you always ended up finding somebody to be like a co-collaborator or in the
Y-
process, or is just with like theater that you would do that? Or would you do that with your other writing?
Well, I did have a couple of women who helped me with the space between time because I had written a lot of it, but I just felt stalled. And so they helped me kind of clean it up, get rid of certain things that because a lot of times you write and write and write and write, but there are certain things that slow down the action. You need to write them. You need to know that backstory of that character. or whatever, but you don't need it in the story. So
Hmm.
they helped me with that. They helped me with transitions. But unfortunately, both of them have died now, so I don't really have anybody at the moment. And yes, I think having a writing partner, I have friends on Facebook, and actually both of them have been on my podcast as well, who are writing partners. So they'll call each other. They don't live in the same state even,
Hmm.
but they'll call each other on a day, like a given day, and they'll write together for half an hour, or maybe it's a couple of days a week or something.
That's interesting
And
because I kind of see that like in musicians, we're kind of, we always tend to do that,
mhm,
but I never knew, I'm a poet before I became a musician. So I
mhm,
wrote poetry and then translated it into lyrics. And I did have friends. I have some best friends that I
mhm,
would like, is this really working? I would have somebody
mhm.
I could like take a demo and send it to them before I unleash it on the world. And they kind of give me feedback. Oh, that's not working. Or this is not working.
Right.
I take it or leave it. But yeah, it's good to have people that inner circle that you can bounce stuff
Mhm,
off of. And I would think, yeah,
mhm.
anybody that's in the arts probably has some friends that help them do that.
Yeah. Now, I can run things by my friend Dave, who is the actor, because he read the space between time, and I'm thinking to myself, oh, I'm so sorry, and he said, oh no, the world building was wonderful, and it's a beautiful story, and so I've had other people, I haven't sold a whole lot of copies, but I've had other people say, when is the second one coming out? Hurry up and finish. And I'm like, really? I didn't think it was that great,
Well, that's the
Um,
thing. Like, I think a lot of artists are kind of self-critical, and that's always
mhm,
like the thing with like whether or not, like, because you might like when you're a musician, sometimes we have hundreds of songs that never see the light of day,
right.
and
Oh
sometimes
yeah.
we have to actually have friends say, "Hey, one that you think isn't good, that's actually the good one." Because sometimes
Yes.
the best this person to decide what the song should be released isn't always the artist, because like the
Mhm,
artist sometimes it might be too personal or they don't think it's going to work, and that's the song that works. Like your best friend pushes you, or some editor or producer says that's the one and you don't agree. But I find that, I don't know, maybe in writing that happens too, but in music it happens a lot that the song that you think the audience would like is not the one
yes.
they like. It's the one that
Right,
you would have never put out.
right. Well, I think what you just said kind of touches on vulnerability, because it's that was the most difficult thing for me to learn, and that's why I started writing the blog the Sage Woman Chronicles blog in 2013, was so I could learn how to not be so guarded
Hmm.
of a writer, and to just let all my, foibles hang out there. And I think that it's the people who are vulnerable in whatever art form they choose to do are the ones who touch people the most. I'm
Yeah.
not saying they sell the most artwork, but I think that it's being vulnerable is really.
Yeah, if you think about, like, I always point out, like, Neil Young's voice, right? If anybody's ever heard Neil Young, it has a
Mhm,
vulnerability to it. He has an
mhm,
honesty to it that he sometimes will
mhm,
allow himself to put stuff down that some people would say, "Well, why are you gonna put that out? Because your voice is cracking or it's going in this
mhm.
kinda off." But he would put these things out,
Right.
and people would start to say, like, "Whoa, you actually can put out music that has happy accidents or is not perfect or is a
Mhm,
little out of key because there's some honesty in it." And then people
mhm,
started to look at it, and you get the Kurt Cobains, they looked at what Neil did. And there's a lot of people in the industry that looked at what he did. And they actually, a
mhm.
lot of alternative musicians, you know, in the 90s
Right,
were always name checking Neil Young because of the
right,
way he does things.
right. Yeah. So there are authors out there that I think are so vulnerable. And some of them write nonfiction, like Brene Brown. Her work is all about vulnerability and shame, and in her nonfiction books, she shows, oh, this is what my husband and I went through, and that's when I learned thus and so about my research. I mean,
Mhm.
that makes it so memorable for me.
Yeah.
Um, but also there are actors who are really, really vulnerable, and I think they're the ones that a lot of people gravitate toward. I
Well, it's
mean,
kind of like the
also,
method acting, like Joaquin Phoenix, or you get like get De Niro and
mhm,
Pacino, kind
mhm,
of just name checking, old
mhm,
school. But
mhm,
the fact that they could get into a character and like kind of get
mhm.
lost in it, like a
Yeah.
method acting style,
Mhm,
where they can find something painful and then
mhm.
actually live it, and you
Yeah,
can see them living it on stage, and they
right.
become that pain, or they become that
Yeah,
emotion. You're like, that is so powerful when you see an actor that's able
yeah.
to do that.
Well, and I do tell my actors that it's the actor's job to make the audience feel what their character's feeling. But there is also a danger to deep method acting because you can end up like Heath Ledger and not be able to get out of the character.
Yeah, he couldn't get out of it. I mean, it looked like Pacino was always able to get out of it. He might have had
Mhm,
struggles, and De
mhm. Yeah,
Niro is
yeah.
famous for,
Mhm,
going into like Raging Bull and like actually gaining weight,
mhm.
losing weight, getting into shape. He would just become
Yeah,
whatever the character needed it to be. And that probably is hard on your body. If you do
yeah.
drastic weight change just for the role, it's probably not good for your health. But,
Well,
method actors will go that far.
right. And it's also not good for you psychologically either. And so Dave always, whenever acting students would, because he would team teach with me with acting, and if they had a really difficult scene, he would say, "Okay, this is what I want you to do. Say your name to yourself a whole bunch of times until you start feeling like yourself again, so that you can get out of that really
Would you
emotional
get back to
scene."
yourself? Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, because the I think the way Americans translated the Stanislavski method, it was a little too like therapy.
Too much.
Yeah, and no,
Too extreme.
I'm not belittling anybody who uses those
Mm.
methods and is successful, and that's the way that it's best for them. Uh, but you got to be careful. I'm just saying you have to
Well,
be
yeah, I
careful.
mean, musicians, we're kind of famous for having our stage self, which is a lot of musicians use theater, right? If you think about like
Mhm,
Freddie
mhm, mhm,
Mercury, you think about
mhm,
Prince, you think about David Bowie. David Bowie was probably the prime example, and Lady Gaga's kind of in the same spirit of
mhm.
actually going into, like, he became Ziggy. He
Right.
became Aladdin Sane. He became the Thin White Duke. He would become those characters, and a lot of times he actually would stay in that character. It was
Mhm.
I heard he stayed in Ziggy for like a year. He actually
Oh,
didn't take, he would stay in the Ziggy Stardust even when he was off stage. He wouldn't
oh,
get out of it.
yeah.
But that was his method. That's the way he did it.
Mhm,
But a lot of
mhm.
musicians, in order to be on stage, they almost are a hyper version of themselves, or this other self. Like,
Right. Well, and I can understand that because, you have to hype yourself up to go on stage and be that character or whatever. You have to get in a certain state of mind, is what I'm saying. It's sort of
yeah,
like athletes have to get in the zone.
yeah. But it's like a, maybe not as intense as a movie, because movie could be on the set forever. Musician might be on the set for like 2 hours. But for those
Right.
2 hours, they actually become somebody else, you
Right.
know? And
Right.
then sometimes it's hard to come down off of that if you're in front of 300,000 people and you were that other
Oh,
person,
oh my
you
gosh.
know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the amount of energy between the audience and the performer,
Yeah.
that's what's so addicting in a way.
Yeah, it's very difficult. That's what I've had, like, discussions I'm a producer with musicians, like when they get on tour and they're in front of that 200,000 crowd festival, and then they get off stage and they're back in like the tour bus.
Right.
There's a problem that you can get into if you don't
Mhm.
have somebody show you how to get out of it, like the
Right.
way you were saying. Because if you
Mhm.
never get any training how to get out of that, and you just go from 100 down to zero, it's
Right.
not good.
All of a sudden.
Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
good for you.
Yeah, right. It is hard. Well, I was talking with a documentarian on my podcast, and Jason Sherman, I think his name is, and he was saying when I'm making the documentary, I'm in the creative mode, and then when I finish that and I have to edit it and I have to market it, he said it's almost like I have to go through this grieving period of being out of the creative part and
This
then having
creative
to,
zone. Yeah, you
yeah,
get
that
more
creative,
into the like analytical kind of more editing. Like if but the difference between an artist that goes in the studio and just puts it down, and then you get a
mhm,
recording engineer that starts looking at it and
mhm,
trying to actually make it work, right? Where
right,
with artists, I could just stream of consciousness do something and do tons of
mhm,
takes, and then the
mhm,
recording engineer is going to kind of figure out how to make it
mhm,
work right, or the
right,
producer is going to make it figure out how to work it right, and then the artist can kind of just walk away and then come back and make choices about what
right.
those other people show them.
Oh,
But
yeah,
they can just
exactly.
be a pure artist
Yeah,
when they're putting it down, and they don't have to think about the mechanics of what it is unless
right.
they want to do it.
Yeah. Well, and I imagine it's like that for movie actors because you take a little take and then you go away and they set up for the next take. Well, you may have to do that take more than once. But when you're done with that take, you go away while they're setting up for the next whatever it is that you're going to film. And uh I read this not too long ago that all those famous people that were on Friends, like
Hmm.
Brad Pitt and Bruce Willis and Tom Selleck and oh gosh, who else was on that show? Excuse me. They were terrified because it was in front of a live audience.
Yeah, they're not used to
They
that.
weren't used to that.
Yeah, they
And
were
they were
they were
like so nervous.
yeah, it's
And I
hard
can
because like the live television audience like is totally different than when you have the scenes that are done in a more like don't have that. Then
right,
you're in a different world, and you probably it's kind of like the feedback when you're a musician in a club, right? Versus being in the booth. If I go out to a club and there's 300 people versus
uh-huh,
being in the booth with my recording engineer, right? There's only two or
right,
three people in that room
right.
versus like
Yeah,
300 people on the stage, and you behave
right.
different. And
Mhm,
sometimes we
mhm.
actually like to we'll bring recorders to the
To
live
live.
show and actually bring it into the studio and edit it because we
Mhm.
find that sometimes there's more life to the live. We'll actually do a live version in front of an audience, record it to machines, and then actually use that because it
Right,
actually ends up having more life to it and more energy to it than what we did in the studio. And technically, in the studio, we might do other things that we can't do in live, but a lot of artists will take that live cut because it does have a different
right.
character.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, so what else do you wanna talk about?
Well, in terms of your philosophy about teaching theater and your spiritual practice, maybe talk about
Mm,
those concepts.
mm, okay. Um, my philosophy of teaching theater well, my philosophy of teaching anything actually is everyone has a genius for something. And it might not be you might not be a genius scientist or mathematician or whatever or an artist or something, but you do have a genius for something. There's a reason why you're here on the planet. So it's your job to kind of figure that out. And that's my I suppose that's my spiritual philosophy as well. But in acting, anybody can be a good actor because we're doing it all the time. You're one person at work, you're a different person at home with your family, with your friends, if you're out shopping, you have these little roles that you play that are
The,
different
like,
from each
like a
other.
mask that people wear, and they talk about masks. I've heard the idea
Mhm.
of a mask. They like you have a
Yeah.
different mask for different people. Do you kind of think of it in that term, or you think of
Yeah.
it a different way?
Yeah, I mean, I've never said it that way, but yes, that's right. And so always when I would say that at the beginning of an acting class, I would, because, the thought of getting up on stage in front of people is one of the most frightening things that anybody can do. Whether you're giving a speech or you're acting or you're singing or you're dancing, or, I mean, it's frightening. So, but I would see their faces and I would see them kind of go, oh, okay. Now, that didn't mean that they weren't nervous when it came time for them to do their scenes. But, we would give them techniques for relaxing a little bit, like doing some physical activity to get rid of the adrenaline and right before you did your scene and things like that. But yeah, so my philosophy is that everyone is here for a reason. Even that's my spiritual philosophy too. Everyone's here for a reason. And the more I learn about myself, the more I heal my wounds, the more it helps everybody else on the planet. That's how I go ahead.
That's a good way to think about it. I'm part Cherokee, so we have a lot of spiritual concepts in Cherokee Native, indigenous culture, and it's different than what people would expect, in the Western concept. But the idea of spirit animals and having a connection to like Gaia, or the idea of a Gaia type of thing. But so in terms of your spiritual practice, what are your type of spiritual practices?
Well, I grew up in a church, but my husband and I stopped attending, I don't know, in the 90s sometime. And we did this intensive reading of Deepak Chopra, Greg Braden, Marianne Williamson, Neil Donald Walsh, Gary Zukav. I can't even think of all the teachers that we read. And one of the very first ones that I read that I went, was M. Scott Peck's The Road Less Traveled. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
Yeah, I've heard
it
of that.
Stayed on the New York Times bestseller list, #1 on the bestseller list, or maybe it was just on the bestseller list for like 9 years or something.
Yeah, I remember seeing it. I think when I read the paper, I saw it in there.
Yeah, and the very first line of the very first sentence is, "Life is difficult." And I remember reading that and going, oh, yeah, life is difficult. And everybody says that if your life is difficult, that something's wrong with you, and nothing's wrong with you, because life is difficult.
That's a really interesting paradigm, because you got like other paradigms, like you said, that will act like, well, there's something wrong with you if you're finding it difficult. But that world view is, it's accepting that things are difficult. It's accepting that you're probably going through like a crucible. You're going through things that you have to fail. Like as a creative person, what I find is I learn from my mistakes. I learn from the failures. Right? Every musician learns from a commercial failure a lot, right? Compared to, like, they probably learn more from the commercial failures than their success, because most of the time we have commercial failures. So it's very rare that we have the success. And when we have the success, we say, well, how did I do that?
Exactly. Right. Well, and that's one of the things that I say is there are no mistakes. It's just lessons. They're just lessons.
Yeah. That's how you actually you learn,
Right, exactly.
Because if you're perfect, how are you going to learn anything? It's like you just say that you're perfect, and that you never need to practice, and you don't need to learn anything new.
Right.
You don't need to pick up a new instrument or a new style or get into a new genre. You're just going to stay in the same lane. Exactly. I find that boring. As a musician or even a creative person, I don't want to stay in the same genre. So as a writer, do you kind of like, you don't want to necessarily stay in the same genre when you're working, right? Do you decide you want to try something different?
Yeah, I mean, I already started a fantasy story, which has just been sitting on my computer for a really long time. But I don't know if I'll ever finish that, because I am into the podcasting. I am into my Patreon community, which I just started recently. And this new course that I'm starting, which is using stories to learn exactly what my parents taught me: good communication skills, critical thinking, compassion, empathy, and emotional intelligence. So I'm creating this course about how to use stories for your spiritual journey. I'll call it that. I'm not calling it that necessarily in the course,
Hmm.
but because I think that all the problems that have ever happened in the world, all the atrocities, all the wars, all of that is because people weren't emotionally mature. They weren't
Yeah.
emotionally, they were trying to stuff their feelings or whatever. And so the more of us who become emotionally intelligent, the better the
Yeah,
world
well,
will
I
be.
think I totally agree because if you think about most violence comes from fear, and fear
Mhm,
usually comes
mhm,
from ignorance. And why do
mhm,
you have that ignorance is because you're not trying to learn, right? You're narrow.
mhm.
Like you
Yeah,
think that you're the only one that knows the truth, and that
right,
tends to cause somebody else. Well, they think they're the only one that knows the truth, and if you two get next to each other, it's probably not going to come out that good,
right,
because because that's the problem is people don't want to back down, and then
right.
people aren't willing to compromise because they get so rigid that they don't see that maybe the better way is to maybe not always win, but maybe decide that, well, today maybe I'm going to learn something from this
Yes,
other person instead of trying to force them to think my paradigm is better than theirs.
right. Well, and I would walk it back even farther than that, is when we feel negative emotions, this is what I learned from the road less traveled, is we stuff them. We stuff those feelings thinking that if we stuff them in a dark corner someplace, then we won't have to deal with them. We won't have to feel them. They won't come back up again and we'll be okay, which is completely the opposite of what happens.
Yeah.
Those feelings do come up again, and this, if they're triggered by whatever,
We
maybe
get
what you were
triggered, and it
taught.
may be like it may come out in an uncontrolled way because you
Right.
were repressing them, and that also
Mhm.
leads to like the negative
Mhm.
consequences.
Yeah, I mean, it's what you were talking about. Two people coming together and they're triggering each other and their dark emotions are coming out. And you know, recent more recent studies have shown, and Brené Brown's one of these people, if you deal with your emotions, if you let yourself feel them when they first happen, then they tend to kind of dissipate, and then you don't have these big blow-ups later.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's like when you have a society that kind of encourages repression in that type of way because it doesn't like you to be honest. I think there's
Mm,
some things where people like to. I have found in certain scenarios or certain settings, you can't actually tell that truth or what doesn't work well,
mhm,
because they just don't want it. Even if you did it, you'd be kind of shunned from
mhm,
it because they're not
mhm,
looking for that, right? They're looking for
mhm,
something else because they got a different paradigm. But I think you have to do what you need to do for yourself.
mhm,
So if you find that's going to be like abusive to you or suppress you,
mhm,
you have to like,
mhm,
well, that's who you are now. Then it's obvious
mhm.
you don't feel good in that spot. So maybe you need to
Right.
find a different place to be.
Right. Well, and there, if you're in a situation where it's dangerous for you to share your truth, you can do it in other ways. You can write about it in your journal, or you can write letters to the editor, or
Yeah,
something,
you find
something
create
like that.
somebody to be a musician. I mean, what we do as musicians, we take the things that happen to us and we put them into songs,
Right.
like
Yeah.
a painter puts something in the painting. So we
Yeah.
take the things that happen and we take it and use it
Right.
um, to
Yeah.
create art. And so
Right. Exactly.
I think you must do the same thing because as a writer, you've got a lot of depth of everything you're experiencing as an
Mhm.
artist ends up being in your work. So I would think that's your
Right.
everything, all your influences, your dreams, your aspirations, everything is
Mhm.
just coming from like the ether or it's coming from like the universe or the muse, and
Right.
it's a combination of the things that you know and things that you
Mhm.
like and things that have happened to you in your dreams and all those things. I think is all
Mhm.
part of it.
Exactly. Yeah. And creative people are just in touch with all of that. It's not that that's not there in other people, because I think everybody can be creative, but some of us are somehow more in tune with it
Yeah, it was like
than
the muse.
others.
Like they used to say, you're like in touch with the muse. I get a lot of musicians will tell me they kind
Mhm.
of feel something coming from the universe, and people are like,
Mhm.
"What are you talking about?" Yeah, but it's
Mhm.
almost every musician I've ever asked that is a
Mhm.
singer songwriter or very creative will say like
Mhm.
sometimes I just wake up and the whole song's in my head, and like
Right.
where did that come from? And
Yeah.
it's like you it's like what I say is like a musician is willing to hear or let the universe kind of tell you without saying no, right?
Right.
Like where right, one a person goes, oh, that can't be, or that can't, but we are kind of in tune where I'll let that come in and let it be, right?
Right.
So when we people are like, well, how can you write? Because I'm actually willing to accept things coming to me and
Mhm.
actually figure out a way to put it down. Where
Right.
other people say, well, that can't be that I could ever do that, and then they never go there.
Right. Yeah. They don't think they can do it, or they're afraid to do it, or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, there's some
But
reason there's something to block.
right. Yeah. And who knows? I mean, everybody has their own, as Carolyn Mace calls it, their own soul contract. And
Hmm.
who knows what a person's soul contract is?
But not
I'm having
everybody's
a
gonna
hard
be a creator. Yeah, no,
right,
there,
exactly. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, it's like not everybody's a leader.
right,
Yeah, everybody, not everybody's gonna be the president. Not everybody's gonna
right,
be a senator or a mayor or a governor. That's,
right,
they're not in their
right.
DNA to do that.
Or a
So
CEO, or yeah,
yeah,
right,
like, then everybody's got the constitution to kind of be that person, but they are who they are, and
right.
everybody has their
Mhm,
own,
mhm.
creative capability. Even if they don't think they do, they probably do. Um, but we're probably near the end of this episode. But is there anything else you would want to talk about that maybe you're working on? You want your audience to know about?
Well, I'm in the middle of creating my course, and I don't even know what I'm going to title it, but it's something about the power of story, and how what we can learn from that, from stories. And so I'm still going through the course. It's on Mind Valley. My course, it's called Course Pro or something like that. And so I'm working on that. And then, of course, I still have my blog. I still have my um, Patreon community and my podcast. So I'm kind of glad that I'm retired now, because now I don't have to teach a class.
And everybody can get to
Go.
all those things you're working on through your sagewoman.life.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. Well, not the course yet. I haven't
Okay.
finished.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. The
But
online
that's
course, I
your
haven't
central.
finished that.
But that's
Yeah.
your central location, and when you have something
Right.
ready, that everybody can
Yes.
get to it from there.
Right. Yes, they can access. I have a children's book that my husband and I wrote for our nephew, our oldest nephew, who's now 40, when he was around 6 years old. And then the Space Between Time is there. And then the podcast is there, and the show notes, and the blog is there. And I even think I have links to some of my social media as well.
Oh, that's cool. Well, that's why we build these websites. I just, for many
Mhm.
years, well, I was on Spotify and all these other places. And then I decided,
Mhm.
well, I actually do need my own site so I can kind of give a theme.
Right.
So because we have a lot of other places we can be as
Mhm.
musicians, and it's just like, we could say an author, well, I'm on Amazon, so I don't need
Right.
a way, but maybe you need a website because you want to kind of have a blog or you want to say something that
Mhm.
you can't say on Amazon. You can't, you can't say on this other platform. So like it's cool to have your own control over what your artistic
Yeah.
vision is. So I think
Yeah.
that's why I find people are into that nowadays, and it's easier to do than it used to be. It was like 5, 10 years
Right.
ago. It was harder to
Uh,
actually put that together.
well, and it's hard for me. So thank heaven my husband is a tech guy, and he
Oh,
helps
your
me.
husband
Yeah.
helps you.
He helps me when I get stuck. Yeah.
That's always good to have somebody to help you.
Yeah, really.
But thank you for being on the show. I think it's really interesting to get different viewpoints from creative people. We like to talk to, like I said, actors, content creators. We've had writers
Mhm,
on our show before,
mhm.
um, and it's just really interesting to have different perspectives on worldview, and we love to bring that to our audience. So we appreciate the fact you're on the show today. I hope you have a good night. And as I said, this will be on Spotify video podcast tomorrow.
Okay.
It will be on all the other podcasts like Apple and Radio Public and places like that tomorrow as well. And thank you for being on the show live here on all of our channels. And have a great night.
Thank you so much. It was really fun.
Good night.